Down here, Hiawassee River this morning. Had to do a bit of a hike to get down here. Caught a couple of little smallmouth so far and a rock bass, but it's like I can't get the big ones to hit just right now. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to do a little multitasking. We'll see how that goes. First off, in this video, I'm going to talk about martyrdom. I'm going to try to do a little multitasking. Try to fish while I talk to y'all. You'll have to bear with me. I'm not the greatest at multitasking. But here lately in my spare time, last couple of days when I've actually had some spare time, I've been reading a lot about how the country of Iran and other countries in the Middle East, how they commemorate their martyrs, their fallen warriors. And all through city streets in Iran, they have murals painted on the walls. They have pictures. Ooh, that's good. Right in a tree. At least it came out easy. That was smooth. This is how they commemorate it, and it's not a phenomenon that is unique to Iran. It's all in these various Arab and Middle Eastern countries. That is how they commemorate their fallen warriors. I remember looking at one picture of a mural in Iran. It was of a 13-year-old boy who had taken a couple of grenades and thrown himself under an Iraqi tank. This was during the Iran-Iraq War back in the 1980s. They painted a beautiful mural to this young boy. Even Ayatollah Khomeini mentioned him in a speech by name, saying that he was guaranteed, this 13-year-old boy was guaranteed stuck. He was guaranteed a seat at the right hand of Allah himself. And this got me to thinking about how here in America we see nothing like this. Well, we see something that is similar, perhaps a couple of times a year. Perhaps on Memorial Day, which we just had last week. Perhaps Veterans Day. But nothing dedicated in the manner of what these Persians and other Middle Easterners do. Nothing in that manner. In fact, it's usually attached to some sort of cheap sentiments of patriotism in this country. I need to quit casting over there. There's something I'm getting stuck on. It's usually attached to some sort of cheap sentiments of patriotism. It's corporatized and all that. But nothing to the extent of what we see in the Middle East. And it's got me to thinking. The problem with the broader right wing in general is they don't really do a good job of commemorating what could be held as martyrs. I'm talking about the broad right wing, not just us in these sort of racialist spheres. I'm not even necessarily talking about the dissident right either. But I mean, how many people, conservatives, could look to Ashley Babbitt as a sort of martyr? It's a name that, honestly, you could say due to the news cycle, has been forgotten. The lady that was killed at the Capitol during January the 6th. A name that's largely forgotten. And it got me to thinking too about martyrs, things of that nature. If we look around, there's several that could be considered martyrs. I just mentioned Ashley Babbitt, even though I would not claim her to be really in the least ideologically aligned with us. We could look at Cannon Hennant, a young man who was gunned down by a black named Darius Sessoms. I believe it was 2 years ago, maybe 3 by now. And then I think back to our side. I know I've mentioned him a lot lately, but Bob Matthews and his merry men. Bob Matthews was a martyr for the cause of the highest caliber. I just finished reading the Bruder, Schweigen. You'll have to forgive me, pronunciation. It's not my strong suit. I'm just a hillbilly after all. But Frank Lee de Silva's 3 books on the Bruder, Schweigen. I'll put links to them in the box below, all 3 of them. You can order them on Amazon. I just finished the last one. And all I really have to say is wow. What these men did is so impressive. They were not just merely some sort of domestic terrorists, as the government would label them, anti-government, all these different labels. They had plans for a sort of territorial imperative up in the northwest of this country. And the plans were extremely well developed. They had a vision of clarity. And they were on their way. But of course, even today, some people belittle these great and brave men on our side. Even back then, you had people like Ed Fields claiming it, and some of these other prominent voices in the racialist spheres claiming that Bob Matthews was a Fed and all this other bullshit. And even today, people act dismissive, or in these circles, people don't really want to talk about these brave revolutionary men with a vision, and a vision that they were working towards. A lot of people don't want to talk about it. Bob Matthews was a martyr of the highest caliber. And the rest of his men, many of whom who died in prison, I would consider them martyrs as well. If there was ever a day in which America balkanized, and we had something of a sort of ethno-state, something resembling it, or an ethno-state, I don't care if it would be in Appalachia, the Midwest, Northwest, Northeast, New England, wherever. What should be done is in every village and town square, there should be a mural, a plaque, or a statue commemorating the Bruder Schweigen. Because these men were martyrs. And as Tom Metzger said, Bob Matthews was the father of the Second American Revolution. But that just goes to show who's in power today, you could say. If any of us was today to put up such a commemoration, it would probably be viciously attacked. And I mean, even the broader right wing in general. Look, during the Summer of Love back in 2020, look at how many Confederate memorial statues were torn down. Statues of any member of our race was destroyed. It was not defended by the state, and even the civilians allowed this to happen. Now sure, I'm not really criticizing the civilians per se, because they would have been labeled and been put in prison most likely. It just goes to show you who's in power. I mean, they even took down and beheaded a statue of Hans Christian Heg. Hans Christian Heg was from Norway, and he was an abolitionist from up in Minnesota. I'm gonna make a video talking a little bit about him. But they even desecrated a statue of someone who fought for the Union and died at the Battle of Chickamauga, which is not too far of a drive from where I live today. Let me grab this. All I do is cast into tree branches and get stuck, it seems like. But having a good time regardless. Bad day fishing is better than any day wage slaving. But that just goes to show who's in power, you could say. And they allowed this to happen. Thankfully, I think they are repositioning a statue of Robert E. Lee somewhere else in Virginia. But I mean, so many of these monuments were desecrated. The right wing, and even our circles, we need to do a better job of commemorating those who came before us. You could consider Commander George Lincoln Rockwell a martyr. Joseph Tomasi is another name. Here soon in the future, I plan on taking a trip to the grave of Ben Klassen. Ben Klassen is a very interesting character, a very interesting man. He wanted to create a unique sort of worldview and religion for the native European. He called it the World Church of the Creator. And his tombstone, unfortunately, the little necropolis, it's in a beautiful area down in Otto, North Carolina, probably about 2.5 hours away from here. I'm going to take a trip there, a sort of pilgrimage. And I want to do a little something to try to at least clean up his grave. Just a little bit. It's overgrown. It's been neglected for years. This is a mockery. This is a travesty. And I want to do something about that. But we need a new Hall of Heroes. And while we certainly are not in power today, if there ever was a day to come, this situation should be rectified. Got a little rock bass here. That's all it seems I can catch today. Get them in there. This is going to be a leftover from my video called Horror and Beauty. It's about accelerationism. But right now what I want to talk a bit about is suffering. You know, in our society today, where materialism, comfort, and convenience are viewed as the highest of ideals, it seems. Our society today views suffering as unnecessary and perhaps as the greatest of sins. There's a video, and I've mentioned it numerous times before. I'll put a link to it in the box below, by Didymus Sumidid. He talks about January the 6th, social decomposition. I know I've mentioned this video numerous times over the years. But in that video, and I'm quoting him, suffering was not held to be bad in any sort of traditional society. Suffering was something to make you stronger and to prepare you for doing great things. And it's a very good video. I listen to it probably once a month or so because I find it motivating. And as a people, some of the more optimistic types will not like to hear this, but we are going to have to suffer a lot more before we are ready to do something important, you could say. There's going to be a lot more blood spilt. Many bad things will happen. You know, I'm interested in what the varied philosophers, a lot of them talk about suffering, and I'm particularly fond of Nietzsche's view on suffering. You know, a man, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said that he judged the test of a will by how much abuse, torture, all these things, how much of that this will to power can take and use it as a sort of catalyst. And that's what we're going to have to do. That's what we will have to achieve. Now, on a personal level, you know, suffering could be labeled as a broad term, I guess. There's just the everyday suffering, the pains of existence, you could say. The pains of living, having to get up, make your living by the sweat of your brow, things of that nature. And then there's other types of suffering. Some suffering that is much more dire than others. You know, suffering makes or breaks a person. And my friend Billy Bob, he said before, resistance builds character, but it also reveals character. And I believe you could quote that phrase with suffering. Suffering builds character, but it can also reveal character. Now, on a personal level, suffering, we all suffer to varying degrees. Some much more so than others. I went through a period of suffering. I've talked about it before. I call it the years of meth. This was personal suffering that I inflicted upon myself. I wasn't a victim. I was a criminal. I was a thief. I was a drug addict. But without those years, just to give you an idea, I don't want to delve too deeply into this. I don't want to take too much time talking about it because I've spoke about it in the past. Physically, back in late 2015, early 2016, when I started consuming that shit regularly, every day, my weight dropped from about 150 or 155 all the way down to 118 pounds. I looked like a walking skeleton after being on that shit for a couple of months. I looked bad. Eventually, I learned to eat while consuming that stuff. But my weight, even then, it was only about 130, 135. I'm not a big guy in the least. Compared to now, where I weigh about 175, 170, 175. But it was also suffering on a lot of different levels as well. I went through extreme poverty. I lost many things, so many things. I lost a really good paying job in 2017. I fucked up so many things. But not to dwell too deeply into that subject. Like I said, you could look at some of my past videos. During those years, I learned how to operate in such a world. I gained a sort of criminal knowledge, you could say. I learned how to operate. I learned how to survive, and occasionally even thrive, which I think thrive is being a bit of an exaggeration. I don't believe I'd consider anybody that's into those hard drugs to be thriving at anything. But you know, without this personal crucible that I put myself through, 100% I believe that I would not be here talking to you today. I certainly wouldn't. In fact, I may not even have these views. These views that I have would not have grown, been cultivated, and blossomed into what they are without everything that happened before, without the suffering, every event, every little thing. I would not be here today speaking to you. You know, when I got clean about 4.5 years ago, I learned things. You know, the seeds for my worldview were planted long, long ago. But without all that hardship and self-inflicted suffering, wouldn't be here. I learned things about the Sacklers, I learned things about how the system just wants you completely fucked up. They want your family ripped apart. They want you in legal trouble. They want you weak. They want you confused. They want you miserable. Because miserable people are easier to control. When I learned these things, I was very angry. You know, I used to say that hate has a home here, that hate keeps me on the straight. It keeps me on the straight and narrow. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that love didn't have a part of this. You know, that's something I like about Louis Beam. If you listen to any of Louis Beam's speeches or interviews, he talks about how we do this for love. Our enemies will say, oh, it's about hate. Well, hate is a part of it. Because I consider hate to be a part of love. Because really, I think it was Commander Rockwell that said, without hate, love is an empty catchphrase for hippies and queers. And this is the truth. You know, our leaders, these elites, they're trying to create a world without hate. But you should ask yourself, if they're so dead set and intent on creating a world without hate, what does that say about their ability, about their wishes regarding your ability to love? You know, Louis Beam said those German soldiers on the Eastern Front, they weren't there because of a hatred for the you-know-whoish tribe and communism. They were there because of a love of their Volk and their fatherland. And that's how I look at it now. My life is, I don't want to sound like I'm bragging or anything, but my life is better than ever right now. And I know sometimes I joke around about doing dope, and sometimes I will not deny, sometimes I miss that life of chaos. I miss certain aspects of it. Because after all, during those times I can say that I lived. I experienced some extreme highs, but I also experienced some very devastating things as well. I've seen the depths of the human soul. I've seen things that were extremely sad and depraved, heartbreaking. Where was I going with this? But without seeing all of these things, I can say, with seeing all of these things, I can say that I truly lived. Danger and chaos, like I said in that video about accelerationism, gives meaning to life. You know, at times, going back to what I was saying about love, yes, that's where I was. You know, my life's better than ever now. Building a family. Things are, you know, if you would have told me 5 years ago that my life would be in this situation today, I would probably have thought that you were crazy. But here I am. So it's not just hate anymore that keeps me clean, it's love. Love for my own, love for my family, love for my tribe. It's a combination of both hate and love, you could say. Because these two things, while they are considered on the opposite end of the emotional spectrum, hate and love they're alike to a degree. I've often thought that the actual true opposite of both of those is indifference. But without all of these things that I went through, that I put myself through, I wasn't never a goddamn victim. Without those things, I would not be here. Like I said earlier, my views, I could have just been a typical conservative. And you know, there's times, occasionally, there's times that this thought comes into my mind about where I would be if I had not wasted nearly a decade. I mean, basically from about the age of 19 up until I was 31, my life was hell on wheels. First time I ever went to jail, I was 19. Last time I went, I was 31. You know, and during this time, it was chaos a lot of times. But that chaos was concentrated during the years of meth. You know, at times I think about, what if I had never went down that path? Where would I be today? How much further along would my life be? How many more possessions would I have, or whatever? But you know what? I quickly put that thought out of my mind because it's useless. And because overall, I value those years because I learned so many things. And I learned things about myself. You know, I had to master myself. I had to conquer myself. I had to kill that part of myself. I learned so many things, though. I quickly put that thought out of my mind and tell myself to shut the fuck up. Because without all of those things, the good, the bad, and the terrible, as I've said a million times already, I wouldn't be here speaking to you today. Now this is the last bit about suffering that I wanted to talk about. In that video that I referenced earlier that Didymus had made, he talked about how a certain Austrian artist would not have been able to come around with his ideas without things that happened in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution, people like Lenin and Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, all those types. Without the suffering that the German nation went through following the close of World War I, that period of history would never have happened. Since I talked about that Austrian artist, I meant to interject here. I believe it was Carl Jung who believed that the Austrian artist was this sort of physical, perhaps manifestation of the ancient Germanic god of Wotan. There's an interesting video, and I'll put a link to it in the box below, by an Irishman. His channel is called Uberboyo. I'll put a link to it in the box below. And he talks about this. He talks about how that Austrian artist was a sort of manifestation, perhaps a vessel, that erupted. And what it was during the 19th century, all this energy that had been building in the various German kingdoms before it was united under one banner, World War I, it was this manifestation of all this energy. Wotan is known as the frenzied one, and that is what it produced. And this will tie into the concept that I'm going to bring up now just a bit. That regime would have never came to power. You see, suffering, and even on a personal level, what you do with suffering, when suffering has been inflicted upon you, what you do is you internalize that suffering. You internalize it, you concentrate it. Now you have to be careful with this, of course, because suffering, this period, could break you. You have to be resilient. But what you do is you internalize that suffering, you let it concentrate, and you crystallize it, and you use it as a catalyst to do things that are extraordinary. Suffering, I mean, look at ourselves. Man is both the marble and the sculptor. There's nothing beautiful in this world that isn't created without a combination, and oftentimes all three of these things: blood, sweat, and tears. Usually a combination of all three things. Whenever a woman gives birth to a child, all three of these things are required. And it is the most beautiful of things in this natural world. We are both the sculptor and the marble itself. Man has to fashion for himself, through the infliction of perhaps self-deprivation, pain, and suffering, to create something that is beautiful and terrible and wonderful. You must learn to do this. And it's like I said earlier, I think our people, we're going to suffer a lot more before we're ready. Now this leads me into something that I really wanted to talk about. This is new territory, you could say, that I've only began exploring the last couple of months. You know, I have more of a pagan worldview, you could say. Some people would probably label me as some sort of atheistic pagan. To that I would say bullshit, because I do believe there are things that happen. I believe in reincarnation. I believe that we certainly have souls and spirits. And I have to admit, I became interested in a term called the egregore. I first learned about this term from my friend Patrick. I'll put a link to his channel in the box below. I know most of you know him by now. He is the one who I first heard this term from, and I became extremely interested in it. You know, I do have a sort of, you could say I have a secular way of looking at things sometimes. I'm skeptical of certain things. But I definitely do believe that there are things that we can't explain. I don't want to reveal too much, but in those books by Mr. De Silva that I mentioned earlier, there is a certain, near the end of the final book, while they are running to evade the feds and the people after them, There's a beautiful scene that Mr. Da Silva describes in which him and Randy Evans are out one night, out in a field in Pennsylvania. Fog is very thick. They were out there outside of a house they were staying, having them a cigarette. And off in the distance, Frank notices something moving, and out of the fog, out of the mist, comes this beautiful, huge, white stag, an albino. He said it had a rack. It was probably a 10 or a 12 pointer. And he took this as a sort of spiritual sign. I thought that was very beautiful. And like I said, you should order those books to help out a really good man and also to learn something. To learn something that is hidden from us, that we only hear one side from. I don't want to give away too much, but I thought that was a beautiful part of his story, of his experience. And I myself, I have had a couple of experiences with crows. 2 times in my life I felt like they have warned me of extreme peril that was on its way. But that's a story for another day. The mind. You know, up until a couple of years ago, when I heard people talk about the occult, about magic, things of that nature, I would have been most likely a bit dismissive to those types. But over time, and especially with what I've been reading lately about egregores, the mind is where the magic happens. Mindset is everything. If you have the proper mindset, you can endure anything, practically anything. Now, of course, there are things that will kill you, but you can endure so many things if you have a why. A reason to motivate you, a reason to push you to never give up. The mind is where the magic happens. And the egregore is an occult term. Egregore is a French word, but it is derived from a Greek word meaning, I believe, wakeful. An egregore is a sort of collective thought. A collective thought that is produced by a distinct group of people. I believe the egregore is first described, I think, in the book of Enoch. I believe that's one of them Gnostic texts. Of course, a lot of this stuff that I'm just talking to you about now, I do not claim to be any sort of expert on, by any means. But the egregore. What are examples of an egregore? Well, an egregore must be a collective thought. It can be an event, it can be a person, it could be a martyr. Symbols are very important to egregores. It could be an ideology, you could say. All it is a collective thought. You could say that the swastika is a representation of an egregore. Also, the hammer and sickle. You see, and that's something interesting I've learned over time. Any sort of mass political movement has some sort of metapolitical and metaphysical underpinnings, even communism. There's a book that I recently acquired called The Occult and Bolshevism. And it talks, and you know, that's something I think that is overlooked because I wasn't aware of this stuff up until maybe a year ago. You know, communism, Bolshevism, it professes a sort of atheism, but if you look deeply into it, there is a deep undercurrent of sort of some of these occult concepts. Another example of an egregore can also be, I think I mentioned a martyr. But hell, an egregore doesn't necessarily even have to be factual to become an egregore. What got me intrigued is, before I learned about what examples of an egregore could be, I've got to be very delicate about how I put this, of course, on this platform. But an example of an egregore would be a certain event, an alleged event that happened in Europe back in the 1940s to a certain distinct group of people. This certain distinct group of people have relentlessly beaten us over the head with this fucking egregore for 80 years now. That is a prime example of an egregore, and like I said, doesn't necessarily have to be factual. Okay, I hope that doesn't get this video taken down. Try to be delicate there. An egregore, we need a collective thought. For a collective thought to happen, for an egregore to be brought into existence as a non-physical entity, like I said, there has to be synchronicity. Earlier, when I was talking about suffering out here in the woods, I mentioned a quote by Nietzsche that he judges the power of a will to be how much abuse that it can endure and turn that abuse into something to use for its own advantage. I made a video, I guess it's been a couple of months ago now, called The Heart Gets What the Heart Wants. I'll put a link to it in the box below. I've got a lot of links for you, I know. Where was I going with this? And in that video, I quoted this quote by Nietzsche. Little did I know, as I was an hour away from here, at Cache Canyon on the Tennessee River, when I came back and I was editing that video, I seen that my friend Ronan had posted that very quote on his Telegram channel, and I messaged him and I was like, wow, that's some synchronicity right there. Synchronicity is when people nearly instantaneously have the same idea. For an egregore to be formed, there has to be synchronicity. You know, here in this movement, as Pat calls it, it seems right now there's just so many factions competing with one another. People's got their knives out. People are at each other's throats sometimes. Myself, I tend to try to avoid this. I will not deny there's people on our side of things that I'm not all that fond of. Some of the big talking heads. But I don't go out of my way trying to stir shit. But what we need is the fashioning of a new egregore. And how could this egregore be fashioned? Well, honestly, as I see it, and this is why I think that accelerationism is important, one of the reasons, we're going to have to grow through suffering. Because when a people suffer, they recognize things. Suffering can bring about a vision of clarity as to who the true enemy is and as how to deal, how to mitigate these problems, how to overcome. It's like I said earlier, I think before we're able to do anything great, we're going to have to suffer a lot more. I know this sounds pessimistic, and I do find myself feeling pessimistic sometimes. I find myself growing impatient with things. But in the end, I'm optimistic. I believe there will be a remnant of our people that will rise, that will persevere, that will suffer unspeakable things, but they will turn that suffering that they endured or our people as a collective have endured, into something both great, terrible, and beautiful. We will do wonderful things, this remnant. The final thing that I want to leave you with, and I've thought about this so often, and I'm sure many of you have as well. What can we do? Usually I like to stick to the classical message. Whether we like it or not, I believe we are on the downward slope. We are in a period of the fall. Our civilization, our society is completely degenerate, completely, it's easy to totter on the edge of nihilism sometimes. I wrestle with this myself sometimes. We are in a period of the fall, it appears. A period of beginning decay. I mentioned earlier that the mind is where the magic is. The divine spark of inspiration. I believe there's something magical about that. Christians, pagans, whatever your worldview is. You know, I've often thought that ideas was God or the gods communicating with you, communicating directly. It's a sort of magic, you could say. The divine spark. There was a divine sort of spark, and the timetable varies among different people, depending on what your view, what beliefs you hold. Some people say it may have been 7,000 years ago. Others, including myself, I believe it was much, much longer in the past. There was a divine spark. And throughout our people's history, this divine spark, beginning long ago, at varying times, grew from the size of a flame of a candle to an all-encompassing, world-encompassing fire. What we are flame bearers. And with what we see today, how we're entering this period of decline, you could say, perhaps the best we can do is try to shield the flame, this divinely inspired flame. We try to shield it from the insanity and the storm going on around us. You know, Tom Metzger talked about how in the future, this struggle is going to take time to develop. He said that he believed the white man has not had his ass up against the wall yet. But whenever that happens, that is when this flame can be accelerated. We can throw propellant, we can throw fuel on it, and it can blaze brightly, and it could be purifying, and it could cleanse. The crucible will be lit again. What we must do is protect this flame until the time is right. Protect it, and remember the storm that we've came throughout all our history, all of our blood-soaked history. Because really, well, I'm not going to say that right now. But we have to remember, and we have to persevere. And I believe we will. Anyways, this video has been long enough. I'll talk more about some of this stuff in the future, perhaps. But just remember, suffering is required to do anything great. Thank y'all for watching. Bye-bye.